Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat in the briefing room at La Roche-Guyon on August 5, 1944, addressing the corps and division commanders who had been summoned from positions across Normandy to hear his assessment of Allied operational methods following the breakout from the beachhead. The commanders expected standard tactical review of defensive positions and resource allocation. Instead, Rommel began by stating that General George Patton's Third Army represented fundamentally different threat than forces they had faced through June and July, and that defensive planning needed immediate revision to account for operational tempo that exceeded anything American forces had previously demonstrated. The assembled officers listened with expressions ranging from professional interest to barely concealed skepticism about whether single Allied commander could fundamentally alter operational realities that were already overwhelming German defenses. Rommel's presentation drew heavily from intelligence reports compiled over previous weeks tracking Third Army's activation and Patton's assumption of command. The analysis included assessments from agents in Britain who had observed Patton's training emphasis on speed and exploitation. The reports documented exercises where American armored divisions practiced sustained advances, covering distances German planners considered unrealistic for maintaining supply lines and unit cohesion. Rommel emphasized that dismissing these reports as exaggeration would be strategic error because Patton's North Africa and Sicily operations had demonstrated willingness to accept logistical risks in pursuit of operational opportunities. General de Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach commanded Panzer Group West and represented the professional skepticism that many officers felt toward Rommel's warnings. Eberbach acknowledged that American material superiority was overwhelming, but questioned whether any commander could fundamentally change how armies operated. The American advantages in artillery, air support, and logistics meant that their forces advanced methodically, crushing German resistance through firepower rather than through operational art. Eberbach's analysis was that defensive planning should assume Americans would advance at predictable rates, determined by their doctrinal methods, and that Patton's personality would not alter these fundamental patterns. Rommel responded by pointing to specific examples from Sicily, where Patton's forces had advanced faster than German intelligence projected and had captured Palermo through operational movement that bypassed Italian defensive positions rather than reducing them through methodical assault. The lesson Rommel drew was that Patton would exploit any gap in German lines with armored columns that would penetrate deeply before defensive reserves could respond. The implication was that static defensive lines would be outflanked and that mobile reserves needed to be positioned where they could respond to deep penetrations rather than being committed to defending forward positions. General de Infanterie Hans von Obstfelder commanded 86th Corps, holding sector east of Caen, and raised practical objection that mobile reserves required fuel and vehicles that were not available. The Panzer divisions that should have constituted operational reserve were being consumed in defensive fighting or were immobilized by lack of fuel. The tactical reality was that German forces lacked mobility to respond to deep American penetrations, regardless of whether intelligence correctly predicted where such penetrations would occur. Von Obstfelder's point was that recognizing Patton threat was insufficient when resources to counter it did not exist. Rommel acknowledged resource constraints, but insisted that understanding enemy operational methods remained essential for allocating scarce resources effectively. The choice was between distributing available Panzer divisions evenly across front or concentrating them where Patton's breakthrough was likely to occur. Rommel advocated for concentration based on intelligence about Third Army's positions and likely axes of advance. The debate reflected broader tension in German defensive doctrine between linear defense that attempted to hold everywhere and mobile defense that accepted temporary penetrations while preserving forces to counterattack. General der Panzertruppen, Hans Freiherr von Funk, commanded 47th Panzer Corps and had experience fighting American forces since Normandy invasion. Von Funk reported that American tactical methods at company and battalion level were predictable, and that German defenders could often anticipate where attacks would come and could prepare defenses accordingly. The observation was accurate for describing American infantry divisions. But Rommel argued it did not apply to armored exploitation once breakthrough was achieved. The distinction between methodical infantry advance and rapid armored exploitation was critical but was not reflected in defensive planning that assumed uniform American operational tempo. The intelligence briefing that Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte provided included intercepts of American radio communications and analysis of Third Army's organization. Von der Heydte noted that Patton's command structure emphasized decentralized decision-making with division and corps commanders authorized to exploit opportunities without waiting for detailed orders from Army headquarters. The command philosophy contrasted with more centralized American methods observed earlier in campaign and suggested that Third Army would respond more rapidly to tactical developments. The operational implication was that gaps in German lines would be exploited immediately rather than after deliberate planning. Rommel used von der Heydte's analysis to reinforce argument that Third Army would operate differently than forces commanded by Bradley or Montgomery. The warning was that breakthrough at any point along front could rapidly develop into deep penetration because Patton's subordinate commanders were trained and authorized to pursue exploitation aggressively. The defensive response needed to assume that any tactical penetration could become operational crisis within hours rather than days. General Edgar Feuchtinger commanded 21st Panzer Division and expressed frustration that warnings about Patton's speed were presented without corresponding increase in resources to address threat. The Panzer divisions were being worn down through continuous defensive fighting and lacked strength for mobile operations that Rommel's concept required. Feuchtinger's question was whether High Command expected field forces to accomplish missions that exceeded their capabilities simply because enemy threat was accurately characterized. The challenge reflected broader problem in German command, where operational requirements exceeded available resources. The discussion that followed Feuchtinger's intervention revealed division among commanders about whether Rommel's warnings should influence defensive dispositions. The faction that agreed with Rommel argued for concentrating available armor where Third Army breakthrough appeared likely, even if this created weaknesses elsewhere. The opposing view was that American superiority was so overwhelming that concentration would not prevent breakthrough, and would simply mean that concentrated forces would be destroyed together rather than sequentially. The debate was ultimately resolved by reality that resources were so constrained that neither approach could succeed. Rommel's personal credibility with subordinate commanders was complicated by his reputation from North Africa, where he had conducted mobile operations successfully, but also by recent weeks, where German defenses in Normandy had been systematically overwhelmed despite tactical competence. The respect that commanders held for Rommel's operational judgment was tempered by recognition that even brilliant tactics could not overcome material disparities that characterized situation in France. The question was whether Rommel's insights about Patton's methods would matter when broader strategic situation appeared hopeless. The conference concluded with Rommel issuing directive that intelligence services should prioritize tracking Third Army movements and that corps commanders should prepare contingency plans for responding to deep American penetrations in their sectors. The directive was professional and appropriate, but lacked enforcement mechanisms because resources needed to implement responses did not exist. The result was that Rommel's warnings were acknowledged, but were not translated into operational changes that would affect how forces responded when Third Army began operations. The events of subsequent days validated Rommel's assessment with precision that highlighted consequences of not heeding his warnings. Third Army's advance beginning August 1st moved with speed that exceeded German projections, even among commanders who had accepted Rommel's analysis. The distances covered in single days surpassed what German intelligence considered possible while maintaining unit cohesion. The operational tempo created situations where German defensive positions were bypassed before commanders recognized that American forces had penetrated beyond them. General der Panzertruppen Adolf Kuntzen commanded 81st Corps in Brittany and experienced Third Army's advance directly when American armored columns reached positions that intelligence had projected would not be threatened for several days. Kuntzen's after-action reports described American forces appearing on roads that should have been beyond their operational reach based on previous advance rates. The surprise was not that Americans advanced, but that they advanced so much faster than defensive planning assumed. The gap between Rommel's warning and actual defensive preparations meant that responses were improvised under crisis conditions rather than being executed according to plan. The telephone conversations between field commanders and Army Group B headquarters through early August reflected growing panic, as Third Army's movements created operational crises faster than headquarters could process reports. The duty officers receiving calls from corps commanders requesting permission to withdraw or requesting reinforcements were overwhelmed by a number of simultaneous emergencies. The command system that had functioned adequately when American advances were methodical broke down when multiple breakthroughs occurred simultaneously across broad front. General der Panzertruppen Walter Kruger commanded the 58th Panzer Corps and attempted to implement mobile defense concept that Rommel had advocated by positioning available armor to respond to American penetrations rather than defending static lines. The effort failed because fuel shortages prevented movement and because American air superiority destroyed any German column that moved during daylight. Kruger's experience demonstrated that even when commanders accepted Rommel's analysis and attempted to implement appropriate responses, material constraints prevented execution. The personal toll on Rommel of watching predictions materialize while defensive measures remained inadequate was evident in conversations recorded by staff officers. Rommel expressed frustration that warnings given weeks earlier had not produced defensive adjustments that might have limited damage. The professional disappointment was compounded by recognition that even if commanders had fully implemented his recommendations, German resources were probably insufficient to contain Patton's operations. The question was whether better preparation would have created opportunities to slow American advance or whether outcome was predetermined by material disparities. The meeting that Rommel requested with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge on August 10th to review Third Army's operations included presentation of intelligence showing American advances that had covered 200 kilometers in 10 days. Von Kluge's response was that these results demonstrated American material superiority rather than validating predictions about Patton's operational methods. The interpretation was that any American commander with similar resources would have achieved comparable advances. Rommel countered that Bradley's forces advancing simultaneously had covered significantly less distance with equivalent resources, and the difference was attributable to command philosophy rather than to material factors alone. The debate between Rommel and von Kluge represented broader question about whether individual commanders mattered in modern industrial warfare, where material advantages appeared decisive. Von Kluge's position was that operational art had limited influence when one side possessed overwhelming superiority in tanks, artillery, aircraft, and logistics. Rommel maintained that even in materially unequal contests, understanding enemy command methods allowed defending force to allocate scarce resources more effectively and to avoid catastrophic defeats that exceeded inevitable losses. The evidence from Third Army's August operations supported Rommel's analysis that Patton's forces operated with tempo that exceeded standard American methods. The comparison between Third Army's advance through Brittany and toward Paris, with First Army's methodical progress through similar terrain, demonstrated that operational outcomes varied significantly despite similar material resources. The factors that explained variance included command philosophy, training emphasis, and willingness to accept logistical risks. These were precisely elements that Rommel had identified in his warnings to subordinate commanders. The tragic irony was that Rommel's warnings proved accurate, but German forces lacked capability to implement defensive responses that might have exploited this intelligence. The commanders who had dismissed Rommel's analysis as exaggerated were proven wrong by events. The commanders who had accepted his warnings but lacked resources to act appropriately were validated in their frustration. The command system that should have translated accurate intelligence into effective response failed because material prerequisites for success did not exist. The specific example that demonstrated consequences of ignoring Rommel's warnings occurred at Avranches, where Third Army exploited narrow corridor to break out from Normandy into Brittany and toward Paris. German intelligence had identified Avranches as critical choke point, where concentrated defense might contain American breakthrough. Rommel had specifically warned that Patton would exploit any gap at Avranches with maximum speed, and that preventing exploitation required positioning reserves to counterattack immediately. The actual German response was delayed and piecemeal because reserves were committed elsewhere and because command decisions were too slow to match American operational tempo. General der Infanterie Dietrich von Choltitz commanded forces in Normandy and later Paris and witnessed Third Army's movements with professional appreciation for operational skill being demonstrated. Von Choltitz's memoirs recorded observation that American armored columns moved with confidence and speed that reflected command climate where subordinates were empowered to make decisions without waiting for higher authorization. The contrast with German command procedures, where tactical decisions required approval from multiple echelons, was stark and explained why American forces could react faster to developing situations. The staff officers who worked with Rommel through August documented his increasing frustration as intelligence reports confirmed predictions while defensive responses remained inadequate. The morning briefings where Rommel reviewed overnight developments showed pattern of American advances exceeding German projections and defensive measures being overtaken by events. The professional competence that Rommel brought to analyzing enemy operations was negated by inability to translate analysis into effective action. The comparison that Rommel drew between Patton's methods and his own North Africa operations was noted by several commanders who heard him speak. Rommel recognized in Patton a kindred approach that prioritized speed and exploitation over methodical consolidation. The professional respect was evident even as Rommel worked to counter Patton's operations. The historical curiosity was whether two commanders who shared operational philosophy would have developed mutual respect had they faced each other in circumstances where material balance was more equal. The intelligence assessments that Rommel reviewed in mid-August showed Third Army advancing along multiple axes simultaneously, with coordination that prevented German forces from concentrating against single threat. The operational technique of maintaining pressure across broad front while exploiting weakest points was precisely what Rommel had warned would characterize Patton's methods. The defensive response that might have countered this approach required mobile reserves that could shift rapidly between threatened sectors. German forces lacked fuel and vehicles for such mobility and lacked air cover that would protect movement even if fuel existed. When Rommel warned his generals about Patton's speed in early August 1944, but was largely ignored, he demonstrated accurate understanding of Allied command differences and operational methods that would characterize Third Army operations. The skepticism from subordinate commanders reflected combination of material realism about German resource constraints and professional doubt about whether individual enemy commanders fundamentally altered operational patterns. The subsequent events validated Rommel's operational assessment while simultaneously confirming skeptics' view that German resources were inadequate for implementing effective responses. The episode illustrated how accurate intelligence and sound operational analysis became strategically irrelevant when defending force lacked material means to exploit understanding. The failure was not in Rommel's assessment or in commanders' tactical competence, but in strategic situation that had placed German forces in France in position where knowledge of enemy methods could not compensate for overwhelming disadvantages in resources and capabilities that determined operational outcomes regardless of command decisions.